We continue our discussion with Hennie van Vuuren. He is the author of this book that's called Apartheid, A Tale of Profit, Guns and Money. And this book finally lifts the lid on some of the darkest secrets of apartheid's economic crimes and details of how crimes of the past continue to haunt and cost the South African public today. Hennie, thanks again for staying with us here. So, in the introduction of this book, which already grips your attention, you write about the final act of liquidation that happened, and this was about to begin, where millions of documents containing all of these secrets that we, I suppose, don't know about, the intimate details of agents and citizens, were torn up by hand, packed into these black bags, and then set alight into roaring flames. I mean, are we ever going to know the secrets that those documents actually contained?
Leanne, I think one of the fascinating parts of our own history is the manner in which the previous regime did try and cover up its path. That the Clerk administration did sign off on the mass destruction of records by the National Intelligence Services, today the State Security Agency. Those are 44 tons of documents that were sent in trucks to the furnaces outside Pretoria. But like all governments, repressive regimes, there's an enormous amount of paperwork that's generated. And I think we were really struck by the fact that you cannot destroy everything. You would have had to set alight huge archives right across Pretoria if that was to happen. And so we do have these traces of our history buried in archives in Pretoria, in the National Party Archive, in the Free State, across the country, that when pieced together really start to tell an incredible story and are such a powerful reminder of why secrecy, and the current struggle against secrecy is one that concerns many in civil society and across the country, is why secrecy is so dangerous to a society, because there is no better example than the mirror which apartheid gives us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, do you think that the aim, from all of your research that you've done, the aim of the apartheid government was to strip the country's assets before the dawn of democracy in 1994?
I think if we look at the amount of money that was spent on military expenditure, at one point some economists argue that almost a third of the country's GDP, so if you were to cut up the country's budget into a pie, you take a third of the pie and that would go straight to defense. Today we spend far less money on it, and I think it wasn't necessarily a story of corrupt politicians taking a vast amount of money. That is not the story we uncovered, but it was the money that was spent on weapons, on defense, and on supporting other conservative governments around the world that in turn backed the apartheid regime, which was this incredible wasted opportunity, money that should have been spent on bettering the lives of South Africans and would have placed us in I think a far better position in terms of tackling issues of poverty, of inequality, unemployment today.
Quite interesting is some of the myths that you write about in this book. You talk about the seven myths, including that of the fact that corruption is a racial phenomenon, and freedom signaled a clean break from the past, that we cannot undo this wrong. What does the book have to prove that these myths are wrong?
Yeah, well, I think firstly, evidence is incredibly important, and we hope we haven't just produced a big book, but we've produced a book that's readable. We've had a lot of great feedback from people who are actually delving into the book and are finding that it's helping them to understand a part of our history. So I think that's the first step. And then there are questions around accountability. Now, I think we struggle to get state institutions in South Africa and abroad to tackle some of these crimes. But we have the evidence of probably one of the most sophisticated money laundering operations, according to some experts, that's ever existed in the world. A bank in Belgium, the Kredietbank, and its sister branch in Luxembourg, Kredietbank Luxembourg, that over a 15-year period laundered up to 70% of Armscore's cash used to buy weapons. That's R500 billion in today's rand terms. That was moved across the world into front companies in Liberia and Panama. The bank worked closely with Armscore in Pretoria to set up this architecture, and is therefore, we would argue, and the book shows, deeply complicit in the crimes, not only of apartheid, but economic crimes, which were so central at the heart of this so-called deep state in apartheid.
Unbelievable. I mean, you identified Armscore accounts across at least 27 different countries. What happened to those accounts after 1994?
Most of those accounts were shut down. So I think we saw much of that architecture closed down. The bank withdrew most of its interests in South Africa, from what we understand, and carried on with its business, doing the same kind of thing elsewhere. I think think what's important is for us not only to understand aspects of our own past as a nation, but what does this mean for the way in which banks, for example, and the banks are only one part of our story, but the way in which they operate across the globe, the way in which they support illegitimate regimes and fester wars. And I think it's important for us as a public to understand it, but to challenge that conduct and hold those type of institutions to account for such conduct.
What about local banks? Because I mean, we're speaking about the foreign banks, and I mean, you speak extensively as well about accounts in Switzerland and the happenings in Switzerland. But local banks and the national party donors in this economic crime committed by the apartheid regime, what about them?
Yeah, so while we look very much at this international network of players and secretive players that are involved, I think the South African story is an important one. The question around South African business and its complicity, and the local banks feature a lot less. We recall the story around ABSA, and its and the argument that the public protector should investigate money that ABSA owed as a result of apartheid-era economic crimes. There's no doubt that many South African institutions were involved in economic crimes. We found that wasn't the biggest story. But turning to this issue of party funding, which remains a secret today, and civil society groups argue that we should know who funds political parties, we see big corporations, Naspers, directly cutting checks for the National Party. Very wealthy South Africans. Christo Visser, probably one of the top 3 wealthiest South Africans. Mr. Visser cut a check for the National Party and is described as a long-standing supporter. And those are in the documents, those are from the notes of from P.W. Botha's archive. So, these are not things that we've kind of made up along the way. They're extraordinary evidence of levels of complicity and a reminder for those who aid corruption, who work closely with corrupt regimes, or even corruption in the private or public sector today. The truth will eventually come out.
I mean, I know that the public protector was actually approached to investigate this particular issue, the issue about how apartheid government was funded by some of the banks. How does your book assist those who would like to know more about the economic crimes and the arms money machine and what came out of this leaked public protector report?
Yeah, I think that one of the dangers of us not knowing as a society and not being able to exercise our right to know or the right to truth is that we can often be led astray by political agendas. And I fear that SAIEX report discussion was one of those, where there were bounty hunters who were involved looking to make cash out of the South African government. And the whole public discussion is based on news that's generated by these people. Our archives, our nation's archives, our nation's story is there for us to be able to evaluate it and to tell that story. And I think only then are we able to ensure that there aren't outside interest groups that try and manipulate stories, manipulate the news. And I think that what Apartheid Guns and Money hopefully does is tries in some way to set the record straight. We've touched the tip of the iceberg, but I think we've tried to give readers a deeper understanding of the nature and extent of the network.
I have to ask this question as I wrap up, because I mean, you viewers have to read this for yourself to understand the depth of what has been unveiled here. But what are the ramifications of this book? I mean, have you had any response yet? This is going to put a dampener on a lot of things going forward. SA's current foreign policies, and a lot of people perhaps just saying, "Nah, this is just speculation." But you're not. There's evidence here to support this. So, what has been the reaction?
Well, much silence. We've heard very little from
much silence.
Okay. And I think that it's something that needs time to be digested. The fact that China was not just a supporter of the liberation movements, but supplied weapons to the apartheid regime throughout the 1980s, just as the government of France did. The French former head of state was involved in some of those things. These are all stories, I think, that require digestion. It's going to take time. But as civil society, I think we are going to be starting to start a conversation about how we can look at holding some of these actors to account. Yeah. It's not about looking at apartheid economic crime here and the current issue of state capture there. It's about making the linkages between the two, understanding economic crime in the broader sense over the past 40 years in South Africa, and challenging these corrupt networks, these power networks that continue to exist and morph and change and manifest in our society.
Hennie van Vuuren, wow, unbelievable. So this is the book that has come out, Apartheid, A Tale of Profit, Guns and Money. And this is Hennie van Vuuren's investigation after 5 years, 624 pages of, I think, explosive findings that are here in print with a lot of supporting evidence. So you're going to want to read this. It's absolutely enthralling. I've managed to just get through a bit of the book. I cannot wait to get deeper into this because it's really, really interesting. Hennie, thank you.
Thank you, Leanne.
All right, let's take a break here on the program.